Right now, without looking down, which side does your shirt button on? Most people have to check, something they have done every single morning of their adult lives, and the brain stopped registering it years ago. Now look, if you're a man, right side, always has been. If you're a woman, left side, always has been. And here is the question nobody has ever asked you. Why? Because the answer has nothing to do with convenience, nothing to do with comfort, nothing to do with any practical reason that makes sense in the world you are currently living in. The side your shirt buttons on was decided for you, over 700 years ago, by people who wanted anyone who looked at you to know exactly what class you belonged to, whether you were someone who dressed themselves or someone who required a servant to do it for them. That message, stitched into fabric in the 13th century, is still being delivered every single morning, whether you're listening or not. Section 1. The button as a weapon. Before the 13th century, clothing was held together with brooches, laces, and clasps. No status in how you closed your coat. A king and a farmhand fastened their clothes exactly the same way. Then the decorative button arrived in Europe. Not simple toggles, but crafted precious buttons, gold, silver, ivory, pearl. And they were not cheap. Extraordinarily expensive. The kind of expensive that exists specifically to exclude people, not because the item needs to cost that much, but because the cost itself is the point. By the 14th century, buttons had become one of the most direct, visible indicators of wealth in European society. Not subtle, not requiring insider knowledge, brutally obvious. A wealthy woman might commission a gown with 50 pearl buttons from collar to floor, not because she needed 50 fastenings, she needed 3. The other 47 existed to communicate one thing: I have resources to burn on objects that serve no purpose. Henry VIII reportedly owned suits with thousands of decorative buttons. The buttons weren't holding his clothes together, they were holding his power together. A commoner's coat had 1 button, or 2. The difference between a king and a peasant was, in part, measurable in buttons, and everyone knew exactly what was being communicated. Nobody questioned it. The system worked because everyone accepted the rules. Sound familiar? But the number of buttons, that's just vanity. We understand that. What's more disturbing is which side they went on. Because that decision wasn't about decoration, that decision was about dependency. Here is something most history books mention in passing, but never really sit with. Wealthy European women in the Renaissance and Victorian eras could not dress themselves. Not wouldn't. Not chose not to. Physically could not. A noblewoman's daily wardrobe was an engineering project. Multiple layers, multiple assistants. In some cases, significant physical force. Foundation layer first, then stockings, then the cage crinoline, steel hoops extending the skirt up to 6 feet wide, then the corset. And the corset is where it gets extreme, not gentle shapewear. A rigid structure of whalebone and steel designed to compress the waist until internal organs displaced. The liver, the kidneys, pushed aside by sustained pressure. Getting into a corset required another person behind you, both hands on the laces, bracing against the bed frame, pulling, tightening, until the compression held. Then the bustle, the underskirt, the overskirt, the bodice, sometimes a jacket. Dressing could take 2 hours, every morning, performed by a lady's maid, a professional servant whose entire function was the physical management of her mistress's body. Now here is the mechanical detail that changed everything. The maid stood facing her mistress, right-handed, like 90% of people, and when you face someone and button their clothing, your right hand naturally reaches toward their left side. So tailors moved the buttons to the left. Not for the woman's comfort, for the servant's efficiency. Women's clothing was not designed for the person wearing it. It was designed for the person dressing them. The button placement encoded into fabric a permanent assumption that a woman of any status would always have someone else there to dress her. Men's shirts were designed for independence. Right-handed man, buttons on the right, dresses himself. Natural, self-sufficient. One side said, "You can do this alone." The other said, "You will always need help." Both messages sewn in before the person wearing the garment had any say at all. But the servant theory explains women's buttons. It doesn't fully explain men's. For that, we need to go somewhere older, darker. A battlefield. Medieval knights fought with a shield in the left hand and a weapon in the right. Armor plates overlapped left to right, so an enemy's lance would glance off rather than penetrate. The defensive geometry of armor mirrored the defensive geometry of battle. When military culture filtered into civilian clothing, as it always does, the overlap followed. Left over right, buttons on the right. According to Paul Kears in A Gentleman's Wardrobe, men's clothing was deliberately designed to button left over right to avoid snagging the sword handle when drawing it. The shirt and the sword were one system. And those 17th and 18th century portraits, men with one hand tucked inside their coat? That wasn't an affectation. Men carried concealed weapons. A right-handed man needed his left hand free to open his coat quickly, right hand already moving towards the weapon. The hand-in-waistcoat pose was a demonstration. Dressed to armed in under 3 seconds. It's worth being honest here. The Metropolitan Museum of Art notes that continuous documented evidence linking medieval armor overlap directly to shirt buttons is difficult to establish. Some armor pieces overlap the other way. The theory is compelling and widely cited. But it is a theory. What is not a theory is the end result. Now, no story about 19th century fashion is complete without one particular character. A man whose ego was so vast that some historians believe he literally changed which side buttons were sewn on, because women were laughing at him. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, conqueror of Europe, and by all accounts profoundly sensitive about how others perceived him. The hand-in-waistcoat pose was everywhere in Napoleonic portraiture. Napoleon used it constantly. Women in Parisian society apparently found it amusing and began mimicking it mockingly in drawing rooms. According to one persistent theory, Napoleon ordered women's garments rebuttoned on the opposite side. So any woman attempting the pose in her own clothes would look immediately wrong. The mockery would become self-defeating. No surviving written order confirms this. And the left-right divide predates Napoleon by centuries. He cannot have invented it. But what is documented is that Napoleon used fashion as a tool of political control more deliberately than almost any ruler in history. He dictated what was worn at his court. Whether he addressed buttons specifically, uncertain. That he was exactly the kind of ruler who would, not uncertain at all. By the early 20th century, every justification for the button divide had vanished. Women dressed themselves. The corset was largely abandoned after World War I. The lady's maid was a relic. The sword had been gone from civilian life for generations. The button divide had outlived every single reason for its existence, and every clothing manufacturer in the world kept it exactly where it was. No meeting, no decision. Nobody said, "The reasons are gone. Should we change this?" The system ran on inertia, on the assumption that what has always been done should continue, on the human tendency to repeat the habits of the dead without asking if those habits deserve to survive. And here is the consequence nobody has connected to its cause. Industrial dry cleaning machines are built for men's shirts. Buttons on the right. When a woman brings a shirt to the dry cleaner, it doesn't fit the machine. Wrong side. Manual handling required. Extra time. Extra labor. Which is why cleaning a woman's dress shirt costs more than a man's in most dry cleaners across the UK and the United States. A financial penalty, paid regularly, unquestioned. Because 700 years ago, a tailor moved buttons to the left for a servant's convenience, and the machine built to clean that garment was built for the other side. Two decisions, centuries apart, by people with completely different intentions, quietly extracting a small tax from women who have no idea they're paying it or why. That is how the deepest systems work, not through force, through the accumulation of small, unremarkable defaults, each one inherited, each one too minor to challenge, each one invisible until you start looking. Look at your shirt one more time. If you're a woman, your buttons are on the left because a Renaissance tailor designed your garment for a servant. That assumption survived the servant class, survived the corset, survived the lady's maid, survived the laws that briefly made the wrong buttons a criminal offense, and arrived intact in your wardrobe this morning. If you're a man, your buttons are on the right because medieval knights drew swords with their right hand and needed the left free. None of that applies to your life. The knight is gone. The sword is in a museum. But every morning, without thinking, you reenact all of it. The button started as luxury, became a weapon, became a class marker, became law, became habit, and became invisible. That is how control works. Not through force, through repetition, through the ordinary, through the thing you do before you're fully awake. What else are we doing every day, automatically, that was designed centuries ago to keep a system running that no longer exists? Tell me yours below. On this channel we find those things. We pull them apart. And next, we're going into the drawing rooms of Victorian Britain, into something that sat in ordinary family homes for decades, something manufacturers knew was killing children, and kept making anyway, for over 100 years. Subscribe, because that one changes how you look at your own walls.